My journey began in 2015 when I helped the family of the killed Fargundai out of Afghanistan. The remaining family of Fargundai in Afghanistan asked me to help them to get into safety when Afghanistan fell. My new journey began via the Dutch, via the German, via all the governments I could think of, and all the important people that I could find, the big NGOs in the world and in the Netherlands. I tried to get help, but I was mostly ignored. Our group grew bigger and we started writing and warning the governments about the food position that didn't change. We didn't see any big food shipments towards Afghanistan. There were no tent camps built, and UNHCR was working very, very slow to provide millions of people of food. Planes should be dropping food from the sky day by day. With the worldwide food crisis, we estimate more than 11 million people, and maybe up to 18 or 19 million people can die of starvation in Afghanistan. It is the biggest crisis we've ever seen in modern history. Before the entrance of the ISAF and NATO missions in Afghanistan, the soil could feed the people of Afghanistan. After 2001, when the international coalition came to Afghanistan, we created a situation that the people got used to the food we gave them and the money we supplied them. So the population grew double, while the soil of Afghanistan can only feed with the technique they have for about 18 million people. That is half of the people there are now. So start a new government in exile. And do this with other people, new, fresh, people that didn't sell out Afghanistan, the youth of the future. Ladies and gentlemen, your host for the day, philosopher, writer, and chairman of the Gilgamesh Foundation, Ofran Badakhshani.
Dear all, this is not the first time that I'm a speaker. This is the first time that I'm limited to a written speech, and so in reading this, there might be some shortcomings. And this is a very important day for Afghanistan. The speakers after me will address many issues and many problems, but I'll start with some solutions. By now, you might have heard of the troublesome country that is called Afghanistan. Afghanistan, historically known as Eastern Iran or Khorasan, once was the beating heart of the Persian civilization. It was home to some of the greatest thinkers, poets, mathematicians, artists, and scientists as great as Avicenna, Rumi, Biruni, Zarathustra, and Behzad. They not only contributed to the shared history of humanity, but also shaped our modern understanding of science, politics, trade, art, and culture. Growing up in the Netherlands, I witnessed the gradual transition of Europe from a war-torn continent to an ever-powerful and united union. This gives me the courage and the footsteps of European federalists and visionaries as Spinelli and Jean Monnet to dream of a tomorrow for the Persian-speaking countries and peoples. A future within which true binding elements of brotherhood and tolerance transcend the imposed national borders. Hence, despite all the pain and misery caused by the unfortunate catastrophic turn of events, we are now in a position to rethink our very foundation. Today's Afghanistan was created by an ethno-fascist Pashtun elite who were inspired by Nazism and Panturkism. Within that Afghanistan, as in any dictatorship or tyrannical regime, there was only one past and one story allowed. Unlike in post-war Europe, in Afghanistan, we do not have to invent grounds and shared cultural values. The inhabitants of historical Khorasan and current Afghanistan have a collective memory of cooperation, consensus, and mutual respect that is over 1,000 years old. The only thing we have to do is to tell an inclusive story to initiate a forward-looking perspective. We have to awaken the binding spirits of the Persian culture and language. As we know, real nations with a great and rich history are never uniform, one-sided, or one-dimensional. So, memory and heritage of a nation and peoples will be essential to keep nation building forward-looking. The attention to such cultural values will strengthen the diversity and the perspectives and possibilities for a nation and people. Rich memory and deep heritage are not the ashes of the past, but the flames to lighten up the future. To achieve this, we are not in need of another war. We are in need of a cultural evolution and a persistent but non-violent resistance, a recipe proven by the great Martin Luther King and Gandhi. From these principles, Gilgamesh Foundation, of which I'm a chairman, has initiated a few long-term projects to make this cultural transition possible. First of all, we present stories of hope and wonder. This is how we are doing this, very practical. We evaluate and rewrite indigenous folk stories. We write new stories. We translate from Dutch, German, and English. So we publish attractive new literature for young people. We focus on 3 groups of children, 4 to 9, 9 to 13, and 13 to 17. And when to bring up a generation that grows up with values of gender equality, reciprocity, mutual respect, and tolerance. For this generation, no longer one story and one past, but rich diversity of heritage. Our second initiative is our participation at what might be the greatest educational program in human history. Gilgamesh Foundation cooperates with DONOC by providing a tablet to each family in remote regions of Afghanistan. By doing so, we will be able within 14 months to teach both illiterate parents and children by bringing them reading, writing, and the basics of math, physics, and so on. This can be done even without teaching personnel and physical schools. Our third initiative concerns women entrepreneurship and economic independence. Women are the majority in Afghanistan. Through the working methods of the International Labour Organization and microfinancing projects of the UN, we will help them set up small businesses. By making women economically independent and literate through our DONOC program, they will acquire their deserved position in the society and be the masters of their mind and destiny. As you see, we focus on very practical goals: literacy, cultural development, economic independence, and a culture of cooperation. The reason is simple. We need this to bring up an enduring positive peace, to quote Martin Luther King's clear and immortal words. Thank you. And now I'm honored to introduce Dr. George Stanson, who is a former research professor in genocide studies and prevention at the George Mason University in Fairfax County, Virginia, United States. He is best known for his work in the area of genocide studies. He is the founder and president of the Genocide Watch, the founder and director of the Cambodian Genocide Project, and the chair of the Alliance Against Genocide. From 2007 to 2009, he was the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and he will be speaking on the Hazara genocide. Please welcome Dr. Stans.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be with you today as we contemplate the future of Afghanistan. In particular, I wish to speak to you about the persecution and genocide that has been perpetrated against the Hazara people. The Hazara have been victims of genocide for at least a century. One of the rulers of Afghanistan who consolidated Afghanistan, in fact, carried out a genocide of Hazaras that killed over half of the Hazara population of Hazaras in the 1890s. And that genocide has continued. Hazaras have been excluded from citizenship in Afghanistan, not permitted to hold government jobs, not even permitted to vote for most of Afghanistan's modern history. But in the 1970s, Hazaras were beginning to get fuller rights. And then after the Taliban were defeated, achieved educational equality and full human rights. Nevertheless, the persecution of the Hazaras continued even then, as they were attacked in bombings, in murders, in many other ways by the Taliban, by ISIS-K, and by other extremist forces in Afghanistan. Now, the Hazaras are a very special people in Afghanistan. They have a distinct culture. They have their own form of the Dari language, their own language, in other words. They are a ethnic, distinct people. They also are religiously distinct people because they are Shia Muslims. And that is why they are enemies of the Taliban. That is, the Taliban think they are enemies, as the ISIS forces do as well. So the Hazaras are at grave threat right now in Afghanistan because the Taliban have retaken power. My wife was very involved in Afghanistan this past 20 years. She was the U.S. Agency for International Development's expert on maternal survival programs. She helped to set up many maternity centers and maternal survival programs in Afghanistan. She's been to Bamyan. She's been all over Afghanistan, in fact. And what she saw in Bamyan, in the heart of Hazara culture, was a people who welcomed the education and the future that Afghanistan held. But as you know, in a suburb of Kabul that is largely inhabited by Hazaras, one of the maternity centers that she helped set up was attacked just a few years ago, just a year ago, in fact. And I want to tell you the story of one of the people who was there. Zainab, who was a 27-year-old Hazara woman from Bamyan, had gone there to give birth to her first baby. She joyfully named her baby Omid, which means hope in Dari. Her mother-in-law, Muhammadi, explained, "We gave him the name Omid, hope for a better future, hope for a better Afghanistan, and hope for a mother who has been struggling to have a child for years. But 4 hours after Omid's birth, 3 gunmen, disguised as police, opened fire in the maternity ward, murdering 16 mothers, 2 newborns, and a Doctors Without Borders midwife. Omid lay dead on the floor, covered in blood. Mohammadi wept. She said, I brought my daughter-in-law to Kabul so she would not lose her baby. Today, we'll take his dead body to Bamyan. In May last year, in the same Hazara neighborhood, Dashti Barchi, 85 schoolgirls were murdered in a triple bombing as they left the Said al-Shahada school. Most of them were Hazaras. And since then, there also have been attacks that have murdered boys in a boys' school. People who are attending several of the mosques that Shia Hazara go to pray to God. Since 2015, Islamist terrorist attacks have killed at least 1,200 Hazaras, probably more than that. And the attacks deliberately target their hospitals and their children. These are crimes against humanity. And because they are also intended to destroy a substantial part of the Hazara ethnic and religious group, they are also acts of genocide. The Taliban have hit lists of the names of Afghans who oppose them. These are kill lists that are posted online. And the Hazaras are usually among the people who are targeted. This genocide that must be stopped continues today. And the Taliban say they are opposed to ISIS-K, that is the group that has been carrying out much of the terrorism, the bombings, the murders of Hazaras. But in fact, they don't really try to stop them, even if they know that the ISIS-K people are about to attack. The reason is that the Taliban also hate the Hazaras. And so that is the terrible problem that faces Afghanistan Hazaras today. Now, Afghanistan, of course, just experienced another earthquake just a few days ago. And that area where the earthquake occurred, which is down near Pakistan, but nevertheless, it is an area where there are some Hazaras. And the point I'm making is this is a country that does need all the help that we can give, help that should go directly to the people of Afghanistan. And I urge our governments to find ways to get that help to them because the Afghan people need it. I also specifically request that our governments initiate investigations of the persecution and genocide being carried out against the Hazaras. The UN Human Rights Council should appoint an independent investigative team to investigate the persecution and genocide of the Hazaras, and they should report to the UN Human Rights Council. I also call upon governments around the world, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, all around the world, to give special attention and special consideration to allowing Hazaras to come to their countries as asylees in asylum because they are a persecuted group. They have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of their political, religious, and ethnic identity. For these two policies should be implemented immediately. an investigation by the UN Human Rights Council, special provision for asylum for Hazara refugees. And I also call upon the world's governments to immediately find ways to assist all of the Afghan people who are starving, who are now beset by another earthquake, and who need our help. We are in a world in which we cannot live as individual nations isolated from each other. We are part of the main. We are part of humankind. We must stand together and help the Hazaras and all the people of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stenson. Our next speaker is a lawyer and human rights activist with experience in working with the civil society organizations in Afghanistan. She has acted as a legal advisor and written extensively on the role of women and has led advocacy campaigns. Her work focuses on peace building and bridging communities together to contribute to a positive change in healthy societies. She will be speaking on the severity of crimes against humanity and Taliban's policies approved the elements of an upcoming genocide in Afghanistan. Please join me in welcoming Razia Masumi.
Hello, everyone. Today, we are gathering to request the international community to take serious decision about Afghanistan. We are talking about civilians who are victims of Taliban's barbarism. We are bringing millions of voices here who seek justice but have no access to fair trial and public hearing under Taliban's regime. Taliban and ISIS-K have committed crimes against humanity and violated human rights values since last decades in Afghanistan. Regarding to Article 7 of Rome Statute, Taliban committed and are committing crimes against humanity, such as murder, extermination, deportation of forcible transfer of population, imprisonment and severe deprivation of physical liberty, torture, rape, persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, and gender. Also, enforced disappearance of persons and other inhuman acts of a similar character intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health. People are being dehumanized in ethnic groups such as Hazaras, Hindus, and Tajiks. The suicide attacks against Hazaras and Hindus took thousands of lives. Such attacks on schools and educational centers on west of Kabul indicate the terrorists have organized and planned to inflict serious physical and mental harm against Hazara ethnic group. Terrorists intentionally damaged the morality of this ethnic group by taking their lives. The same organized and planned attacks took place against Afghan Hindu shrine in Kabul. Many of Hindus forcibly fled the country to save their lives. Indeed, the Taliban always denied committing the alleged suicide attacks against this targeted group and referred to ISIS-K crimes in Afghanistan. Literally, the brutal policy of Taliban and ISIS-K is the same. They have one unified mentality, which is killing innocent people. Daesh is carrying black flag and Taliban are carrying white flag, and they have the same symbols on their flags. There is no difference between these two terrorist groups. Daesh is committing suicide attacks. Taliban are killing by shooting, torturing, and executing people. Taliban also committed many suicide attacks against previous governmental employees and public gatherings, such as huge attack in Wazir Akbar Khan in 2017 and Polo Mahmud Khan in 2015, and many other suicide attacks that history and media archived them. The cemeteries in Kabul witnessed the mass killing of civilians in suicide attacks, hiding the identity, hiding religion symbols, hiding the ethnic dress code, make a big worry among these targeted groups. It reminds of dark shades of Holocaust and Rwanda. Taliban are classifying the ethnic groups and distinguishing them according to their belief and opinions. In Mazar Sharif, many Shia families dedicated part of their property for religious gathering, where women joined, and they also conducted literacy courses for women. After the Taliban took over the country, these families removed all Shia's religious signs from outside and inside their homes until not being visible in the eyes of Taliban. Because these families experienced the same fear during 1990s, the first duration of Taliban's government. Taliban have imposed their dictatorship and using their power and forced Hazaras residents of Patu and Kandi districts of Daikondi province to leave their homes. Many of these forced displaced people say that Taliban treated them inhuman and violently. Taliban have brutally tortured and killed the civilians in Panjshir, Andarab, Kapisa, Parwan, and Takhar. One of the eyewitnesses said that Taliban had shot the former National Army police, including his family members in Panjshir, after identifying him, without hearing from the victim's side. To weaken and exclude the minorities' ethnic groups, Taliban imposed systematic discrimination against civilians. We can see such discriminatory acts in different fields. One of the victims said that while distributing humanitarian aid in the 6th district of Kabul, Taliban have firstly distributed food packages among their own families and acquaintances and even sold them in the black market. He added that he went 6 consecutive days and stood in long queue to be able to get food. One day he took his son by himself, and Taliban were beating them and slashing them, and he and tens of other people couldn't get any food packages after such a long wait. They also beat his son, and he got severely injured. Taliban now take the food control predominantly and treat ethnic groups and slaves and plan to starve them. Civilians are enduring every day from all these inequalities and civil brutalism of Taliban. Taliban dehumanize children and women, who are the most marginalized groups in the society, by sexual exploitation. Rape is associated with humiliation and damage of the human dignity, which increases feeling less valued and resulted in being dehumanized. According to a victim's statement, Taliban soldiers were invading a house and asked the father of a girl that they came to marry his daughter by threatening them with their weapons. They forcibly took the girl by themselves. Her father told us that one of Taliban soldiers told him that you have to sacrifice your girl for the sake of Islamic Emirate, and it is an Islamic marriage. Her family has no news from that girl, and her mother lost her mind in terms of excessive shock. It is not an Islamic marriage. It is rape. Taliban cannot legitimize and cover their acts and clean their names under their flag symbol. In another case, Taliban stopped a passenger bus and took out all women and gang raped them in front of their husbands, brothers, and fathers' eyes in Kabul-Kandahar highway. They brutally tortured the women and killed them afterwards. Women have no privacy and security at all. Many girls were abducted by Taliban in Mazar Sharif and were gang raped. One of the victims said how it's possible to continue living with all such fears and grief because some of the victims already committed suicide as they couldn't endure anymore. There is not only the one case or 2 cases. There are a lot of similar cases which spread the scope of rape as crimes against humanity against Afghan women. In particular, families in targeted ethnic groups are the first degree of victims of rape under Taliban's regime. If there is no security of women and girls, how it's possible to work, obtain education, and make decisions in different aspects of development of the country? We shouldn't overlook reality. The reality is that streets are not safe, the homes are not safe, The main root of this insecurity should be dried first until our girls can go to a school safely. According to the facts and victims' statement, Taliban recruits soldiers among children and destroys the next generation future by practicing the culture of extremism and brainwashing them and sexually abuse them. Taliban are hunters of handsome boys on the streets. Families have huge fear of sending their boys to school or playing on the streets. Taliban have no mercy on children, and they are hunters. Taliban are organizing themselves and recruiting teenagers to be able to resist and continue their authorities. They are well prepared for taking over the next generation moral and influencing them by imposing and training their system of violence, which is killing, torturing, committing suicide attacks. Few weeks ago, a forced confession of Afghan YouTubers by Taliban indicates again their hardship dictatorship. These YouTubers were convicted of reciting Quran wrongly and endured torture and inhuman behavior. But the reality is that Taliban are acting against what is written in Quran. They have double standard by interpreting religion for legitimizing their inhuman acts. The Taliban soldiers are listening to their leaders without understanding why all this violence should take place against other human beings. This ideology is too dangerous and is a huge felony in the world of humanity. The victims received the most severe punishment, such as stoning to death, beating and torturing, which all these acts are against human dignity. The daily facts that we are gathering screams the reality in Afghanistan. Taliban are taking revenge on people who work for freedom and do not accept their authority. According to Genocide Watch research, for crimes of genocide, some steps need to be taken by agents to commit genocide. Referring to the mentioned facts, the elements of calcifying, symbolizing, discriminating, dehumanizing, preparing, and organizing against targeted group of Hazaras, Tajik, and Hindus are met, and it's the threshold towards an upcoming genocide. It is a time to take action and not only speak. The criminals become more powerful day by day. Civilians are paying the price of their brutalism. I'm bringing the voice of those women who were chanting for freedom and peace, and got answered by Taliban with rape, torture, and being killed. I'm bringing the voices of children who do not know what waits for them under Taliban's darkness authority. Yes, tears come to our eyes, but it's not time to cry anymore. It is time to fight back and stand against Taliban's brutalist Islamic authority. We are talking about millions of lives. We intended to file these cases at International Criminal Court to advocate for defenseless people of Afghanistan. As Nelson Mandela said, what counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to live the life of others that will determine the significance of the life we live. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bravo. Thank you, Rosa John, for that brilliant contribution. And our next speaker is an investigator who has been investigating human trafficking since he was 16 years old and involved in anti-trafficking efforts all over the world. He has a degree in psychology and finishing a master in investigation and a graduate certificate in trafficking and persons investigations, and currently works with the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative. And Adam Zarnovsky will be speaking on human trafficking, slavery, and sexual exploitation under the Taliban regime. It's my great pleasure to welcome Adam.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here speaking with you all. I will be speaking today about evidence of human trafficking, slavery, and sexual exploitation occurring in Afghanistan, as well as to evidence of the fundamental nature of the Taliban as an organized crime syndicate. Despite my experience in these matters, I have never before seen anything like this slavery, which is occurring right now in Afghanistan under the rule of the Taliban. My remarks today are not to be taken as an expression of personal views, but rather as a summary of the accumulated evidence. We have uncovered extensive evidence of widespread sex trafficking and forced prostitution in Afghanistan by the Taliban. Restrictions on women's rights to move about freely greatly contribute to this underground sex trade, with widows and younger women being particularly affected. The situation in Kabul is now so bad that it appears comparable to what we saw happening in ISIS-controlled areas of Iraq and Syria. This is not particularly surprising, considering that the Taliban and ISIS-K have begun working together in many parts of the country. Despite religious prohibitions on alcohol, women in brothels are frequently forced to drink and are drugged against their will while being violently raped, revealing how concerned the Taliban truly are about abiding by Islamic law. All too frequently, children are forced to work as sex slaves in these brothels. When it comes to the sex trafficking of children, our evidence points to crimes by the Taliban that are particularly heinous. With special focus towards certain ethnic groups, both boys and girls as young as 4 years old are being targeted by the Taliban for the sex trade. Young boys are increasingly targeted for bachabazi, or boy play. This is where the young male child is essentially made into a sex slave for the Taliban. However, this is not the end of the horror for these young men, as the Taliban, like any trafficker, utilizes trauma bonding to replenish their own ranks. When the boys become too old to sexually exploit, they are then forced to become child soldiers for the Taliban cartel or their allies across the border in Pakistan. Additionally, we have evidence of widespread kidnappings of Tajik and Hazara boys by the Taliban. These boys are then forcibly dressed in Taliban garb and insignia as child soldiers, so that resistance forces target them, and are then marched to the front lines to reveal sniper positions upon being shot or to clear minefields by detonating the explosives with their own bodies. The intent of these kidnappings appears not to be for tactical or strategic objectives, but rather to purposefully decimate the young male fighting populations of these specific ethnic groups. At the same time, we have verified numerous eyewitness accounts that detail how young girls are similarly abducted, often at gunpoint, and forced to become sexual and domestic servants in homes and other residences. The severity of the sexual abuse has become so immense and widespread that families no longer allow their children to go to school out of fear of the Taliban raping their children. Now, since having seized power, the Taliban go door to door in cities and villages and toss houses, searching for any children that families might be hiding. If they find a young boy, they force him to serve in bachabazi and eventually as a child soldier. If they find a virgin girl, they forcibly marry her to one of the Taliban president, claiming it to be an Islamic marriage. Women in Afghanistan are especially vulnerable to the crimes of the Taliban and can rarely even find protection among their own families. In January of this year, 8 women were arrested in Mazar-e-Sharif by the Taliban, who claimed that they were not being escorted by a male relative. The Taliban then proceeded to violently gang rape the women. Those who survived the gang rape at the hands of the Taliban criminals were then murdered by their own families in honor killings for having engaged in sex outside of marriage. Our research reveals that women and young girls also experience forced marriage at an alarming rate under the Taliban. Women are treated as little more than cattle, mere property for the settlement of debts and disputes. They may be bartered away to settle a debt, and men send their daughters and wives as payment to other men with whom they find themselves in civil or criminal disputes. According to the World Health Organization, over 50% of married women in Afghanistan became married as children. As of this May, however, counting only since the Taliban took power last August, nearly 120,000 girls have been sold as child brides, with girls as young as 20 days old being offered up as future brides. We have also uncovered numerous reports of organ harvesting from persecuted minority groups by the Taliban and other criminal networks inside Afghanistan. Many of the victims of these organ harvesting operations did not survive. With increasing famine, ordinary Afghans are increasingly selling their organs, especially the kidneys, simply to feed their own families. It has been extensively documented that labor trafficking and debt bondage is common throughout the country and is a way of life for Afghan children. Per the International Organization for Migration, at least a quarter of Afghan children between ages 5 and 14 work in the dangerous roles found in brick kilns, carpet factories, salt and coal mines, metalsmiths, welding works, and more. Adult Afghan men also similarly found in such horrific conditions. Over 50% of all children in Afghanistan are laborers of some sort, and many work more than 12 hours a day, every day. These abuses have been allowed to fester for a long time, having often been ignored by the international community and even the Afghan government when it was in power. In one case in Logar province, nearly 550 young boys were sexually abused and raped by teachers, principals, and other officials over a 5-year period. When the victims came forward, the Afghan government threatened the victims into silence. Indeed, victims of both rape and bachabazi are often charged as criminals and held in barbaric conditions in prison, where they are frequently tortured. The United States also explicitly prohibited its soldiers from rescuing or intervening on behalf of the enslaved. Many former US soldiers have recounted hearing the screams of children being raped from their barracks at night. Some brave soldiers who refused to look the other way, such as Green Beret Sergeant First Class Charles Martland, were court-martialed and discharged from the armed forces that they had so honorably served. By failing to address the human trafficking situation in Afghanistan, deeming it a cultural matter instead of one of organized crime, the world lost the hearts and minds of the Afghan population and allowed the Taliban to return to power. These trends affect and destabilize the entire region, not just Afghanistan. Moreover, the Taliban's trafficking operations are enabled and supported by those in Iran and Pakistan, which benefit from the cheap and abundant source of slave labor that Afghan refugees provide. Nearly 2.4 million Afghans, over 1 million of whom are undocumented, reside in Pakistan, with over 3 million residing in Iran, where over 2.3 million are undocumented. We have evidence that young Afghan girls are trafficked and sold into Iran as brides, while Afghan boys are sold into slavery in both Iran and Pakistan as forced laborers. Afghan women are frequently abducted, raped, and then sex trafficked as prostitutes in Pakistan by the Taliban and their allies. The Taliban also facilitates sex trafficking in the region, with Iranian and Pakistani women frequently being sold into prostitution in Afghanistan. And Iranian women are frequently trafficked to Afghanistan to be sold into prostitution or forced marriage in Pakistan. Additionally, we have documented numerous cases of the rape of Afghan children by Iranian border and customs forces, who then turned the children over to the Taliban to be further exploited. All of this is occurring amidst a backdrop of crushing poverty and famine. Yet, this problem is set to get much worse if the world does not intervene. With the looming global food crisis brought about by Russia's blockade of Ukraine, over 19 million Afghans are facing the prospect of death by starvation, well over 3 times the number that perished in the Nazi Holocaust. The Taliban are richly funded from this trade in human beings, which is intricately related to the international drug trade that also finds its nexus in Afghanistan under their rule. Scores of Afghans are compelled by the Taliban to toil in the poppy fields and drug labs in forced labor. Similarly, child soldiers that are conscripted by the Taliban are forced to become addicted to drugs to ensure their loyalty and serve as suicide bombers. Moreover, youth are frequently forced to serve as drug mules across borders and regions while their families are threatened or even held hostage. This results in the Taliban's single largest source of funding. Afghanistan is the world's leading source of opiates, including heroin, which the Taliban exports to its organized crime partners in Russia, Pakistan, and Iran, alongside ever-increasing amounts of amphetamines. From here, these substances are exported to all corners of the world, into Southeast Asia, the Americas, Europe, and the United States, and consequently also fund the atrocities of the Mexican criminal cartels. Approximately 3/4 of the world opiates are produced in Afghanistan, killing thousands of our citizens every year. To put it simply, Taliban rule of Afghanistan is a global security threat that undermines the national security of countries the world over, no matter how far they lie from the steppes of Afghanistan. As mentioned previously, many Afghans are forced against their will to work in the poppy fields and production labs of the Taliban as little more than slaves, demonstrating how the issues of human trafficking and narcotics production are deeply intertwined. The evidence indicates that for the Taliban, this is all about power and control, so that they can exploit and profit off of the people of Afghanistan. The individuals and groups that support the Taliban operate in the same manner and share the same goals. Religion appears to be a mere means to an end for them, and the way they justify their crimes to themselves and to the world. This is more characteristic of the operation of an organized crime family than of a functioning government. Their inability to govern and provide for the people of Afghanistan only reinforces this parallel. Indeed, the Taliban place extortive fees on all exports, especially opiates, ores, minerals, and auto parts, and they demand a cut of all food or humanitarian aid being brought into the country. These are obviously not the actions of a legitimate government, but are more like those of a crime syndicate. Simply put, the greatest mistake the world has made in dealing with the Taliban was in treating them as religiously motivated extremists instead of the greed-driven criminals that our evidence shows them to be. Thus, proper policy for dealing with the Taliban involves stronger action and policies not only against them, but also their immediate business partners in Russia, Iran, and Pakistan as well. Actions should include travel restrictions to keep the criminals in their home countries, unable to spend their blood money abroad in our countries and in our financial institutions, while also preventing them from fleeing the consequences of their actions at home. These organizations are, after all, merely smaller parts of a much larger, coordinated network of organized crime throughout the world. Indeed, it seems that the narcotics production, extortion rackets, and especially the human slave trade are key aspects that NATO failed to address during their 20-year adventure in Afghanistan, and are why the Taliban were able to return to power. It is critical that we do not continue to treat the Taliban as a legitimate government, for they are not governing Afghanistan. Instead, we must treat them as the criminal robber barons that they are and work to bring them to justice. Central to this goal is stopping the human trafficking and sexual exploitation that is occurring and that has been allowed to continue unabated in Afghanistan. Likewise, diplomacy and negotiation will not work with the Taliban, who have refused to change their ways despite every opportunity afforded them. Civilized nations do not grant diplomatic status to the Sinaloa cartel, the Russian mob, or the Sicilian mafia, yet they do the Taliban, and this exception must be ended. To this point, the International Criminal Court and all other relevant jurisdictions must formally and expediently investigate and indict the Taliban on charges of crimes against humanity. Only then will we be able to stop the genocide of the Afghan people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your contribution. And our next speaker has recently completed his postgraduate studies in education policies for global development. And as a part of his political and education activism, he has spoken in various national and international events and photo exhibitions across Europe, and recently gave a TEDx talk to raise more awareness about the situation of Afghanistan. And he will be talking about the role of the international institutions and foreign policies on the issue of Taliban hunger and genocide. Please join me in welcoming Najib Azad.
Ladies and gentlemen, while the world has forgotten about Afghanistan and the entire attention of media is on Ukraine, which is indeed a critical issue that needs to be addressed. But what about Afghanistan, that have been in a similar and now worse situation than Ukraine for the past 40 years, and that paid the ultimate sacrifice against the former Soviet Union from 1979 till 1989, which Ukrainian people are giving now against Russians. There are some questions I would like to put here for you all to think of throughout this session. What are the human costs of these wars? Who benefits from these wars? And why do we have ineffective international institutions and foreign policies that lead to more wars? And why such a stark difference between the value of a life of a citizen from Afghanistan, Ukraine, or United States? While we are sitting here today now, Afghanistan is suffering under the Taliban regime. The country is facing one of the biggest displacement crises in the world. Over half of the population, 23 million people, are in acute food insecurity. 8.4 million people are facing emergency level food insecurity, and 1 million children are at risk of severe malnourishment. Fundamental rights of the people are taken away. Girls are not allowed access to secondary education. Women are not allowed outside without a male companion. Women and girls are sexually enslaved. Foreign TV and content is banned. Systematic persecution and act of genocide against Hazaras and persecution of many other ethnic groups in Afghanistan is ongoing. And the government is an all-inclusive Taliban government comprised of mostly one ethnic group in Afghanistan ruling over a country consisting of more than 50 diverse ethnic groups. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is worsening every day, and based on UN projections, by mid-2022, Afghanistan could face universal poverty, with 97% of the country living below the World Bank designated international poverty line of $1.9 a day. Food security levels have plunged at an alarming rate, leaving half the population facing severe hunger, including 9 million in a state of emergency food insecurity, the highest number in the world. Economic decline, drought, and high food prices have resulted in 18.9 million people, 45% of the population, projected to be facing crisis or emergency food insecurity from June 2022 to November 2022. And based on UN estimates, 3.2 million children will suffer from acute malnutrition in 2022, and 1 million severely malnourished children are at risk of death And according to a report by Save the Children, up to 121,000 children in Afghanistan may have been exchanged for death since August 2021. All this, and still, the richest country in the world, United States, have frozen $7 billion of Afghan reserve funds, giving half of it to 9/11 families for which people of Afghanistan had no share in. In addition to the humanitarian situation, killing of ordinary people, genocide of Hazaras, and persecution of many other minority ethnic groups have increased. Hazaras have been attacked in education centers, maternity hospital, sports centers, passengers en route to their houses, wedding halls and bazaars across the country. Now and during the past 20 years by the Taliban and their allied extremist groups, and throughout previous centuries, most notably during the period of Abdul Rahman. After the Taliban takeover, the genocidal act against Hazaras increased extensively, starting in Geti, Kahur, and the Hanikol district of Daikundi, which resulted in killing of the villagers from that area. These crimes also continued against the Uzbek people in northern Afghanistan, in districts of Qaisar and Aqcha similarly. In Panjshir, Taliban entered the city and started looting, torturing, and killing ordinary civilians, hanged the president of Amrullah Saleh, former intelligence chief of Afghanistan, and did not even allow his family to bury his body. Further, due to the resistance movements, activities in Andarab and other provinces in Afghanistan, members of resistance movement have been targeted across the country. People have been shot dead with a suspicion of affiliation to these groups. The Hindu Sikh minority groups, only Gurudwara was bombed last week. The Taliban did not stop in committing such acts against the dead and ruined the grave of Ahmad Shah Massoud in Panjshir and completely destroyed the statue of Abdul Ali Mazari in Bamiyan. Even before the collapse of the corrupt puppet government of Afghanistan, in my own native province of Ghazni, on 17th of July 2021, 43 civilians were killed by the Taliban in Malistan district. Houses were looted and women were sexually assaulted. Prior to this, Taliban attacked on Jowhari district, where I come from, and killed 63 civilians, including many of my childhood friends who went to the mountains to defend our district against the Taliban. Afghanistan's modern history have been intertwined with war and conflict. Since I was born, for the youth in Afghanistan, 9/11 played a major role in shaping the future of their country. A horrific attack planned by Al-Qaeda, who were given homage in Afghanistan by the Taliban. A group originating its roots in America's support during the post-Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to educate and arm the existence of this group against the Soviets. Despite all of the controversies about the responsible terrorist group behind 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda is a foreign terrorist group whose leader was killed in Pakistan and not Afghanistan. And to summarize the reason behind war on terror, it was the war happened in the wrong country and for the wrong reasons. And if we consider the amount of terrorism around the world now, one would think, was it a war on terror or a war for terror? That led to death of more than 46,000 civilians, made a country suffer for more than 20 years, promoting a centralized democratic puppet government on a nation that has deep roots in community-based governance and not a centralized government. Promised state building at the same time as counter-insurgency efforts involving drones controlled by pilots from abroad, which based on a UN report killed on average from 100 to 500 civilians every year. And giving false promises to more than 30 million people in Afghanistan that democracy will change their lives. And at the end, leave them alone in the hands of an extremist force, formerly trained and armed by the United States during the Soviet occupation, who is now renamed and called the Taliban. The main reason the war on terror started in Afghanistan was in 2001 still exists in a much more extreme degree. The main justification of war on terror was protecting the Western interests due to the threat posed from Afghanistan by the two terrorist groups back then, which was later justified by women's rights, democracy, and state-building efforts. What about the 13 terrorist groups who are active in the country now? Does two terrorist groups not pose more threat than 13? It makes me think if this was a war for terror or a war on terror. What about protecting the interests of Western countries now? Protecting women's rights now, protecting minority ethnic groups' rights now, and the state of democracy. And why such a shameful agreement was made between the United States and the Taliban about the future of an independent democracy, and Afghanistan was officially handed over to the Taliban. This is where the role of international institutions like the UN and the International Criminal Court and other intergovernmental organizations come into play to hold both the internal and foreign perpetrators accountable for the situation in Afghanistan, and to initiate a comprehensive investigation to bring justice to millions of families affected by war crimes, genocide, and rule of a terrorist group. This is where we act as human beings who have feelings and are not only physical beings, without the most human value of caring about one another, whose only difference is being born in a different part of the world. My ask from everyone around the world and here is, start with yourselves, contribute and give voice to the concerns of the forgotten people of Afghanistan, and raise the question of who else is worth saving. And if international organizations are not playing their role, we need to question their existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Our next speaker is a retired lieutenant colonel, well, not fully retired, as he is still active in the Norwegian Joint Headquarters. He has been in service for a little over 39 years and 20 years active in the Norwegian Special Forces. He has been involved in Afghanistan since 2003 and 2016 for the last time, if I'm correct. In Afghanistan, and he will be talking on the unfinished business we have with the Taliban. And please welcome Martin Steindl.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, when the US president decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, it created an intense evacuation operation from all the allied nations involved in the NATO-led operations in Afghanistan. Since the Afghanistan forces still not was prepared to operate completely on their own, and the leadership abruptly abandoned the country, the Afghan government collapsed. It gave all the government employees no other choice than to leave their positions, and the Afghan forces also laid down their weapons by orders from their leaders, and they went home. It's possible to elaborate more on this issue, but anyway, that is basically what happened. By the end of August 2021, when the last plane left Hamid Karzai Airport, there was still some countries who continued to evacuate the local employees, and arrangements were made between the Qatar and the Taliban to make this happen. At the same time, there were many NGOs and initiatives from numerous organizations that tried to save former governmental personnel by extracting them to other countries, and with some success, eventually to a third country that would start processing them for visa and a safe life. The Crisis Response Unit, or CRU, or 222 as it also was named, was built up by the Norwegian Special Forces from 2007 to become a robust special police force who created safety and stability in the Kabul province. As a matter of fact, it was my squadron in the Norwegian Special Forces that started to train this unit, with their commander at that time, Haji Ghulam Dawood, and he was a colonel at that time who later became a general. During their years of operations, the CRU sent many Taliban leaders to prison. They responded to numerous attacks in Kabul together with their Norwegian Special Forces mentors. Since day one of Taliban takeover, there have been a massive hunt for government employees and specific for the special police units. When they are found, they will be tortured and killed. Unfortunately, many have been killed already, and the United Nations has reported, and that's on the web, at least 100 plus former governmental employees have been killed. And that report is a few months old. We are talking about several hundred in total. Taliban are looking for revenge. And even if the former employees don't support the Taliban, they actually do not pose any threat to them as of now. So there is no other reason for the killings than pure revenge. Taliban has, by help from Pakistan, restored much of the biometric database, since all the special forces personnel together with the governmental employees were validated through that system. The information stored in this system will lead the Taliban to know who they are, and that will make it possible to find these people unless they go into hiding or escape, if possible. The biometric system is spread all over the country with more than 600 systems. So the Taliban has the power to identify the personnel which are within that system. And I also must say, and it's a shame that the ANDS, Afghanistan National Development Strategy, that they leave all the databases and documents in hard copy behind when the government fell. This means that the Taliban now has this in their possession. In this database, they not only have the record of the personnel, but all the families and relations. We expect the number of killed to rise shortly. We are now up to more than 600 killed by the ANDS. As you probably remember from the media, shortly after the takeover by the Taliban, they issued an amnesty to all former employees. But as everything else, this has proven not to be in effect. Now we have hundreds of personnel in hiding inside Afghanistan and in neighboring countries. Families are split up, and people are living under not only the threat from the Taliban, but with no possible income to feed their family and pay their rent if they even still live in a house. When we left the country, we basically made all of our brothers in arms lawless and persona non grata in their own country. With no income and no security, they are living in a prison. Like those I have contact with now, who live in central places, cannot even leave their house. Searches are common on a daily basis, and random killings as well. The killings of former Special Forces personnel and high-ranking officials are well documented and is addressed by the United Nations and Human Rights Watch. But still, there is a little support from other governments to address this issue. The Ukrainian war has changed the focus totally, not only in the public opinion, but also in the media. Those countries that established application system to help Afghans and even went out in the media talking about it are not responding in any good way. Norway took out only 115 CRU personnel and around 650 in total. United Kingdom took several thousands, but now there is no response in their application system. Although they now have launched a new initiative, but this focus not on the former governmental security personnel, so it looks like a very narrow path to freedom. I know about personnel who had worked for the British government for a decade and had to flee the country, and still there is no solution in sight. New Zealand, who was in charge for the CRU or 222 for 2.5 years, don't want to help any of the remaining CRU personnel either. And even my own the Norwegian government have stated that they will not help any of the 222 personnel left behind. They have stated that in their website. We have seen a change recently where the governments are now focusing more on women, activists, and journalists. I have nothing against these groups, but what about those who have been fighting against the Taliban for years? Why should they suddenly become banned by the European countries? We now have a situation where the people lost a job overnight, cannot support the family, and face the risk of being captured and killed. This has created a lack of food, also overnight, and families are suffering since their father or mother no longer have a job where they can earn money to support even their basic needs. We have a situation where it's pouring money into Ukraine, and the people from Ukraine are entering the European countries with a minimum of paperwork. And they're even allowed to start working for a living instantly as they arrive the country of destination. This is a discrimination of the Afghan people who face starvation and possible death by the Taliban. Since the Taliban at this pure existence is nothing but a criminal dictatorship that uses religion as its excuse while they actually are strangling their own population. From my years working with the CIU, we trained female operators in driving, shooting, and investigating procedures. We did this so we could behave respectful when searching women and their belongings on operations. We also have female operators left behind. We trained the Afghans to do a proper job when they were acting within the population, searching for the bad guys that posed a threat to the public. I have heard that some high-ranking officials have stated that the Afghans fought for their own country, not for us nor NATO. That's why we do not have any obligation to help them. I will put this in another perspective. We entered Afghanistan with a massive military force to eliminate the threat to America and to the European countries. We now see that the Taliban and the partners, Al-Qaeda, are traveling freely around to the European countries, and we should be aware of that it's likely that at some stage they will pose a threat to our society. The Taliban will not be able to contain Al-Qaeda nor the ISKP. Neither do we, since we have no presence in the country. To do the job we were set to do when we were in Afghanistan was the help from the locals Afghan, so also were supposed to safeguard their own population when the Allied support was no longer needed. That's why I strongly believe we have a moral obligation to help these people still living under threat in Afghanistan. NATO stated that it took out all their employees, but that is not true. They only transferred the people who were on duty, and those who were at home, even with valid papers, were left behind. When I realized that NATO had the people left behind and approached them, they just stated that each member nation should stand up and safeguard its people. But it seems like the member countries do not have the intention of doing that. NATO must respect their obligation to fulfill the transfer of the people left behind, and even those who addresses this to a member state of the NATO alliance faces a long road to a possible rescue. I hope that our politicians, no matter which country they belong to, realize that we put the Afghan people, and in particular those who work for the former government, at severe risk by abandoning them like we did. I think it's a huge difference between when you decide not to interfere in another country's internal problem, then do you on the other hand do it and then suddenly withdraw without any working system to take over. NATO and the whole Western community have responsibility for this situation. We must stand up and use our moral compass the way it should be used. By establishing procedures so those who are in need will be taken care of. We can see that there is a resistance movement that is increasing, and I think it's natural given the situation they are facing. But also it creates this dilemma with retaliation from the Taliban. Most of the former government employees laid down their weapons because they were told to and had no strong leadership to back them up. They just want peace. I personally think we should not blame the resistance now emerging, but see how we can, within our possible means, support the population of Afghanistan. It's very unlikely that any person who had nothing to do with a former government and minding his or her business will be pursued in any way, but without doubt, the general life of the Afghan people have worsened a lot since the Taliban took over the country. That's why we need to immediately establish transfer possibilities and find a way to help the Afghan people with their needs. To all of those who are skeptic to Muslims and Afghans in particular, I will say this. Since my first deployment to the country in 2003, I have met many local Afghans that despite we have different religions, different languages, we have worked together believing in pretty much the same values. I have experienced the special police making decisions that were not for their own benefit, but for the cause of right and wrong. I look upon my friends in the CIU as a resource to any community they will be a part of, as long as we give them good mentoring at arrival. Good mentoring will be evident to a good integration for those we are bringing to safety. I want you all to keep in mind that several nations have established different resettlement programs for Afghans at risk and Afghans who were employees during the operations in Afghanistan, but even stated on the governmental websites, it does not apply into any valid application system as I see it. The United Kingdom have their website without anyone replying. The Germans have apparently made arrangements for former employees, especially for those who work for the GIZ, but it seems to be a long way to connect, although the new initiative will hopefully be working, but yet to see. We hope to facilitate for a good transfer for people at risk. My own country, Norway, have stated they will not support any resettlement except through an application which is so limited that it will not work for people under threat. New Zealand have also stated they will not take any responsibility for these issues, even they were a part of the coalition. This, ladies and gentlemen, is nothing but a shame for all of us. That's why we must make it known that we all are being fooled by different initiatives that really doesn't work. Choosing not to engage in these issues could backfire to the whole European community. Of course, I know there's a war going on in Ukraine, but preventing something is often far better than reacting when it happens. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Standel. Our next speaker, like Razia Massoudi, is a living proof of the brilliance and brightness of women of Afghanistan. She is associate researcher with the Free University of Brussels, project developer at CEPS, and head of the project development unit at NANDO, Network of Afghanistan Diaspora Organizations in Brussels. She got her specialization on European policies from the University of Padua in Italy, and is alumna of the European Academy of Diplomacy, and she will be speaking on the result of the 20 years presence of the foreign troops. And please join me in welcoming Shogufta Ghaffouri.
Good afternoon all. Fall of Afghanistan has created a historical scene, both a national and international context. It might only be a false claim to say that the current situation could be fixed in the coming weeks or even months. Considering this, there is one main mandate for all of us, those who cannot fight on the ground to save Afghanistan and millions of its citizens. And that is to make sure that the desire of Afghanistan citizens, specifically women, and their situation is well reflected here in West. It is to make sure that these desires are on the table of policymakers, those who can decide for the future of the girls in the north of Afghanistan, or those on the West, the ones that haven't been in school for months and has no access to their fundamental rights. The rise of the Taliban to power has pushed the country backwards for years. The human rights situation is at an all-time low, and hundreds of human and war crimes are being committed every day. The Taliban are inherently a regime that violates human rights. Within a few months of its rules, the group has enforced primitive laws against women and violated even the most basic human rights. Women have been deprived of the right to education, the right to work, to move freely, and even to show their faces. Forced migration, the disappearance of individuals, and actions against the Hazara and Tajik communities, which is not only a violation of human rights, but also a case of genocide and violation of the laws of war, is being committed by Taliban on a daily basis. Hundreds of people have reportedly been detained, tortured, and killed by the Taliban in Panjshir and Andrab in the recent weeks. One thing to keep in mind is that the collection of information before making any decision about Afghanistan must be independently and transparently. The ceremonial meetings of foreign officials and ambassadors with Taliban officials, who are themselves the main culprits of human rights violation of the Afghanistan citizens, will not help the Afghanistan people and will be only sufficient for the propaganda use of international media. Many foreign countries ransom the Taliban in their official policies, yet the fact that representatives of the Taliban or members of the Haqqani network that planned the suicide attacks in Afghanistan can still travel to a European country could be a great shame for a free European society that claims to respect human values. Western taxpayers have the right to ask their government, what has been the result of 20 years of presence and the sacrifice of thousands of foreign troops, tens of thousands of Afghanistan soldiers, and tens of thousands of Afghanistan civilians? The rule of a terrorist group over the whole country? The resurgence of the international terrorist group that have safely come to power in Afghanistan and can plan and facilitate a new 9/11 attack in the United States, Paris, Amsterdam, or Berlin at any time? Their laws are so primitive and inhuman that they have deprived women of their rights to leave home alone, or imagine that in the 21st century they have closed schools for the girls. Women have no right to work. Such inhuman laws have not been implemented anywhere else in the world. But the international community declares every day that it hopes the same group will respect human rights. I ask the citizens of NATO member countries, the blood of your soldiers, the capital of your countries, the tax money that you pay, the lives of hundreds of thousands of Afghanistan citizens, and 20 years of time were lost for this? To one day express the hope that a terrorist group will respect human rights? The more we ignore the reality of the Taliban as a group opposed to human values, human rights, anti-woman, and anti-education and culture, the more golden time we give to terrorist groups to safely lay the ground for the promotion of religious extremism and to repeat deadly terrorist attacks that killed innocent people in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, this time in European capitals. My message and the message of the people of Afghanistan to all European citizens is that do not ignore the rule of terrorists in Afghanistan. If Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought the war to the gates of Europe, ignoring the safe haven of terrorists in Afghanistan will bring violent religious radicalism to every single street of Europe. To summarize what Network of Afghanistan Diaspora in Europe does, it is to bring all these realities, facts, and voices in the European Union table, to advocate for the rights of millions of Afghanistan citizens who are deprived of their fundamental human rights and driven into poverty, and to advocate for more humanitarian aid for Afghanistan, as well as fair distribution. NADU acts as a hub to unify the efforts of Afghanistan diaspora organizations at the European level. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, and our dear viewers who have been following us online, the conference has come to an end, but not before a few words on the legitimate resistance of the people of Afghanistan. It is for the first time in the modern history of Afghanistan that its peoples have the intellectual, human, and political capital to articulate a democratic and pluralistic vision for their future. To advance their democratic interests, they have the right to organize themselves through all civil and political means. The return of any ethno-fascist regime anywhere in the world poses an existential threat to the idea of tolerance, pluralism, and democracy everywhere in the world. Not to mention the threats to global security and peace emanating from an occupied Afghanistan as it happened in the past. Afghanistan is not a local or regional problem. It is a global challenge. There may be governments who entertain the idea of recognizing Taliban as the legal government of Afghanistan, but it is not. Peoples of Afghanistan preserve the right of self-defense, resistance, and protest against the regime that is the opposition of their rights and dignity. We face the same choice as directly after 9/11. There is terrorism and oppression, and there is freedom and democracy. We all have to choose on which side we stand. Ladies and gentlemen, war is always people's last choice. But when it's imposed by violence, there is no longer a question of resistance and non-resistance. For the non-Pashtun majority of Afghanistan, the dilemma is stark. In their case, it is non-resistance means non-existence. Hence, we appeal to the conscience of humanity. We count on support by freedom-loving citizens of Europe and civil society worldwide, if not on the governments. Thank you very much. Before we take a few questions, if there are any, as some of our speakers were online, but some of our speakers are still available. This conference was not possible without a lot of effort by a lot of great human beings, that some of them are here present, and there is one young and bright lady in particular, Yalda, sitting at the back, who has day and night and has been pushing everyone, sometimes acting like a dictator, but making it possible. And please allow me to thank, in the order of their speeches, Dr. Stanton, Razia Masumi, Adam Zarnowski, Najib Ozad, Martin Steindl, Shugufar Ghafuri. And now if there are any questions on your side to the speakers. And oh yes, of course, and most importantly, the gentleman behind all this initiative, Marcel, whom I only came to know just a few weeks ago, because Bilqis was kind enough to mention and invite me to an online meeting that they had. So he has, in addition to Yalda, has been working day and night almost to make this possible. So thank you, Marcel, for this efforts. And now if there's any question to our speakers or about the conference or about the organizers, then this is the time to ask. It has been all clear? We didn't hear? Yes, all right. Yes, okay.
You know, there's our big problem in the world. We all know. But for me, as a child, 16 years old, I think about the girls who are in Afghanistan, who can't have school, not have education. They are living now in Afghanistan with only hopes. But hopes are not enough. And I think we can do something here in Europe. The government of the Netherlands, the government from Belgium, France, England, and more. They can do something for the girls who are now in Afghanistan. But how? We can give them lessons from online. We can provide online schooling. I have a dream that someday I can say the girls in Afghanistan can also have like education. So that's my call to you, the world, to the government. Maybe somebody are here. Maybe I saw Mrs. from the party here in the Netherlands. So my call to you is, world, help the girls who are now in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Your voice will be heard even if they are not available here present. So, any other remarks or questions? Then I thank you all very much, and also the viewers who followed us online and for their passions and commitment to this conference. And Marcel, once again, thank you very much, and Yalda John, thank you very much as well. Thank you.